Hello. Politically, on the left, I've heard this argument that there's people who, so there's this problem with Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, and there's people on the left who, pretty much real progressives, none of them like Hillary Clinton, and they of course don't like Donald Trump, and I'm of course, I'm part of that camp. Now, the argument is basically, should we vote for Hillary Clinton or should we vote for Donald Trump? And the reasoning behind it is this: if we vote for Donald Trump, this creates the chance that we're going to get a real progressive, in power in 2020, or Donald Trump is going to screw things up so badly that it's just going to get a lot better. At least that's the argument. Now, I actually have to kind of apologize because I'm not actually fixated on the political side of this. I don't know what the answer is to that question. I have no intention of answering it. That's not what this video is about. What I'm interested in is the philosophical distinction between those two positions. Why is it Hillary versus Donald Trump? Why is it, what's the difference there? And obviously, you think there's like a consequentialist difference, right? We think that there's going to be a good consequence if we pick Donald Trump. Hence why we're more likely to vote for Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton. And this is not taking into account her personality and whatnot. Just look at the actual cause and effect of it, right? Whereas having Hillary as a president would certainly be better than Donald Trump. She's not going to screw things up. However, it might not create the change that we want to see in 4 years' time. So, voting for Donald Trump, their position is, you're taking a gamble for the purposes of having a high reward later on. It's sort of a means, to an end type of thing, or the end justify the means. We're not happy with Donald Trump, but it will justify itself if it ends up creating something good. If that were a certainty, then supporting Donald Trump is a no-brainer, if you ask me, because the other choice has uncertainty, but it's not a certainty, so whatever. My point here is the difference in value here, and this has to do with a very foundational principle in economics and philosophy, and it's the idea of value. Now, let's see, how are those two things connected? Well, what's being evaluated in that example are the states of a 4-year time interval with Hillary Clinton as president and a 4-year time interval with Donald Trump as president, and the system in question is the planet Earth, and what happens on planet Earth during that time in those two different scenarios. And what we're looking at is the intrinsic value of those two scenarios and the extrinsic value of those two scenarios. So I'm going to talk about what I believe to be here very important concept philosophically, the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic value. What is intrinsic value? Well, intrinsic value is a function, right? It's a function that takes a system, some sort of system of equations, a system of matter, a state of existence, and a time interval, and it spits out some sort of number, right? It's like moral value. It spits out a number. If the number is high, then that's good. If the number is low, then it's bad. Whether or not it's positive or negative is haven't really figured that one out. But presumably there's intrinsically negatively valuable experiences, like being tortured, for example. Nobody wants to be tortured. But before we get into that, though, I just want to emphasize the point. Like the idea with intrinsic value is that every experience that a human being has some sort of value attached to it. Every time interval, whether I spend that time sleeping or working or eating or doing whatever, there is a value attached to that experience, a intrinsic value. And the idea is that human beings seek to maximize the value, that this particular value. This is the value that all life seeks to maximize. So for every consciousness, there exists a unique intrinsic value function where the consciousness will do things in an attempt to maximize the intrinsic value of its experiences. So that said, it's a pretty clear what the system in question is. We're talking about a time interval from the perspective of a given consciousness, and that is the system in question. And then there is intrinsic value attached to that experience. So, for example, what I'm going to do today has an intrinsic value attached to it. What I'm going to do tomorrow has an intrinsic value attached to it. What I'm going to do this whole week has an intrinsic value attached to it. Now, we could think of it as like the average intrinsic value of the experience, or because presumably the intrinsic value changes during parts of the experience if the experience is very long. If this is something that lasts, if the time interval is a month long, presumably there's points in the month where I'm very unhappy, and perhaps there's points where I'm very happy. Perhaps I go through a hormonal cycle or something. Then, then obviously the intrinsic value is going to change during that time interval. Ergo, what we're presumably looking at is simply the average intrinsic value. Now, the purpose of this intrinsic value, this might seem completely obvious, but the purpose of this intrinsic value thing is that this is a concept that is completely de-emphasized by economic theory. In economic theory, you just have production and you have consumption. And consumption is thought of as this, like, very simple, like, easy scalar quantity. It's just consumption. You know, you buy an apple, you consume it. You know, it's like human beings are these just vortexes that just, you know, the black hole. You just take something and it's gone. Like, you consume it. It's just disappeared from reality. That's the attitude here. It's completely de-emphasized the actual the dynamic value during the consumption itself. We're not really looking at that. It's simply a factor of more consumption is better, less consumption is worse. And that's what economic theory, that's how it looks at these things. And I think that's a pretty, I mean, it's just an unrealistic way of seeing the world. And this is what, I mean, it might seem true superficially, but it's completely unrealistic if you really boil it down to it, because it doesn't include a time variable. Right, and it tries to measure this whole thing with utility, utils or whatever. It's like, all right, you know, this is an example of a thing. It's just like, what are you actually measuring here, though? It's like this weird scalar quantity that somehow the consumer just knows. They haven't actually, they don't necessarily, they just know what maximizes their utility. But what is utility? See, I think utility is just intrinsic value. It's the intrinsic value of the experiences for that person. But that's the difference here, that this is necessarily a dynamic concept, whereas economic theory uses statics, because dynamics are not dynamics screw up the model. So, and this is what Karl Marx was talking about when he talked about use value versus exchange value in his critiques of capitalism. Use value, like exchange value, is the actual money value that you have to pay to buy a thing, but the use value is the value that the sort of the experience value of actually using the thing, consuming it, you know, and that is what I would think. Marx was on the right track, but he didn't really explain what use value was. But he was correct in understanding that there is a difference there, that the economic, the money side of the thing has nothing to do with its actual use value. The use value, or the intrinsic value, is the intrinsic value of the experience of consuming this object, or consuming, like if it's an apple, then it's eating the object, or doing whatever with the object. It's the perceived intrinsic value of the experiences one will have with said object. And it's kind of like that it's how human beings actually make decisions. They're not just consumption maximizers or utility maximizers. What they're trying to maximize are the intrinsic values of their experiences. So what they're actually doing is what your brain is doing is it's allocating time, and it's trying to maximize the certain variables. It's trying to finely tune certain variables within the time interval, within the system, to maximize the intrinsic value of the experiences one will have within that system. It's not as simple as like utility maximization. What does that even mean, right? So the point is with intrinsic value is we're looking at everything has some sort of intrinsic value, right? I defined the intrinsic value of an experience. It's a function that takes a time interval from the perspective of a consciousness and the system in which the consciousness finds itself in, and it spits out a number, and that's the intrinsic value of an experience. You can also look at the intrinsic value of an object, and the intrinsic value of an object would just, again, from the perspective of some kind of consciousness, it's the perceived intrinsic value of the experience of consuming that object or doing something with that object. So for every single object, presumably there is some best way to consume it. So like if I buy an apple, I can either eat the apple and perhaps there's some intrinsic value associated with the apple, or I can throw the apple at someone and find fun in that or something. And perhaps that is a better experience for me if I'm not hungry or whatever. We're not actually trying to look at hunger because hunger doesn't have intrinsic value. And I'll talk about that a bit later. But the point is, looking at the intrinsic value of these experiences. There's the good taste of eating the apple, and there's the fun I have in lobbing the apple at somebody's head and hurting them. So what am I... I'm comparing those two values, and I'm choosing the one that's higher, pretty much. And the time interval will be however much time it takes me to eat the apple / throw it at someone's head. So the intrinsic value of the object is whatever value, the use value, basically, of doing something with this object within the system that I find myself in. Now, it's kind of impossible to look at the value of an object without looking at the system in which it's in. Like, for example, I can't look at, say, the value of... I can't look at the value of a video game without having a computer. Like a video game in a vacuum, that doesn't mean anything. You need to have certain infrastructure already in place in order for you to be able to, quote-unquote, consume this thing. On its own, if the system is just the video game sitting in a vacuum, then it has almost no value. But coupled with a system like this one, where on Earth there's electricity, there's a computer, you can play the game, then it has tons of intrinsic value. However, the computer on its own, that system, that might not have that much intrinsic value because on its own, without the actual video game, there's not much you can do on it. Well, I mean, there are other things you can do on it, but you see my point. I'm trying to categorize and separate everything here. So the intrinsic value of a given object would be, from the perspective of a consciousness, would be the intrinsic value of the experience of consuming this object within the system that the consciousness finds itself in. That is basically the measurement we would be taking. Now, presumably, there's of course uncountably many ways in which one can consume an object. Like I gave you the apple example. You could throw it, you could eat it, you could do whatever. Our brains already have sort of built-in heuristics for what we do with certain objects. We don't make calculations on all the uncountably infinitely many ways of actually doing something with this object. Our brains, given our experiences, past experiences, we have a very easy way of determining, okay, this is an apple. What can I do with it? I can eat it. I can throw it at somebody. That's it. There's not much you can do with the thing. I actually have to slow down and think about, okay, well, what can I actually do with the thing? But for the most part, it's a very simple heuristic, and everything comes from that heuristic because evolutionarily, I simply know that there is one best way to utilize this object, and that is to eat it and get whatever intrinsic value I can from that. So certain experiences might have high intrinsic value, and high intrinsic value will be associated with stimulating the senses in pleasant ways, I suppose, which includes stimulating the intellect. So this automatically includes things like art. And I know I always come back to art, but that's because art is at the heart of this whole thing. And you can't really understand one part of this without understanding the whole framework, but whatever. There's things like art, there's things like eating, there's things like consuming, and then there's a whole bunch of objects that you don't really get to consume. You get them so that you can consume other things. So like the computer example. I get a computer so that I can use the computer to play games or write code or do research and so on and so forth. Things that I might actually find intrinsic value in. Or perhaps I have intrinsic value from simply having a computer. Again, this whole thing boils down to the perspective of the consciousness and where they find intrinsic value. Perhaps there is intrinsic aesthetic value in simply having a computer around. Hence, I don't even need to use the computer for anything. I just need to have it look good, in my room. Stuff like that. But the point is, the reason I brought this whole thing up, and what the hell does this have to do with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump? The reason is that Donald Trump's presidency has less intrinsic value than Hillary Clinton's presidency. Less perceived intrinsic value, because what we're doing is we're making a guess as to what the intrinsic value of the experience would be in the future. Neither of them are elected yet. The assumption that's being made is, okay, if one is elected, what is the intrinsic value of that experience, of Hillary Clinton as president for 4 years versus Donald Trump as president for 4 years? You can also look backwards and say, like, what the intrinsic value is, a long time ago. Let's say during the last presidency, or what I did last week. What was the intrinsic value of that experience? And obviously, there's going to be errors in how we think we calculate the intrinsic value. We might be looking backwards at something with lots of nostalgia, and through rose-tinted glasses, and we might not actually accurately be in our minds representing what the intrinsic value was of a past experience. For example, I'm sure there's people on Earth who think that, oh, it was great back when we had slavery, but it probably wasn't that great, Or it was great living in the 1920s, but once you actually, strip away the nostalgia and look at the reality of it, it probably wasn't that great, But same thing the other way around. If we're looking in the future, that we're also making an error because we don't exactly know what's going to happen in the future. That's just a minor point, but the point is there's uncertainty both ways, both future and past, and the present doesn't really exist. So that aside. So yeah, we're always looking at the intrinsic values of these experiences, and what we're doing is we're trying to maximize the intrinsic value. So this has nothing to do, this is completely separate from the image that's drawn by economic theory, where it's just consumption of utility maximization, which means nothing without a time variable, and which honestly doesn't even mean that much as a scalar quantity, because it doesn't try to get to the heart of this concept of, like, intrinsic value. Like, there's something in the experience itself that's positive that we want to have. And because of that, like many others, I believe that micro foundations of economic theory are just complete nonsense. So this intrinsic value is an important thing philosophically, though. And on top of that, there's extrinsic value. And haven't talked about extrinsic value yet. Well, extrinsic value is simply it's the rate of change of intrinsic value, right? It's not the intrinsic value itself, because it's not intrinsic, but it's the extrinsic value of an experience. So it would be the extrinsic value of a given experience would be the rate of change of intrinsic value of that experience. So assuming that the intrinsic value increases a lot, then the experience will have a high intrinsic value. A high extrinsic value. The average intrinsic value might not be very high. It might be very low. But the rate of change of intrinsic value might be very high, or it might be high near the end. The point of extrinsic value is that we're perceiving an increase in intrinsic value later on. So the idea is, like, for a given experience, intrinsic value is low, but the perceived change in intrinsic value is high. In other words, that the intrinsic value of a following experience is going to be very high. So because there's a positive change, the rate of change is going to be positive, and so the extrinsic value is going to be positive. It's rise over run. It's the intrinsic value of a later state minus the intrinsic value of the given state divided by the time interval. And an interesting note about the extrinsic value of sort of the entire universe is that the extrinsic value of the entire human experience of our entire civilization should be positive for a large enough time horizon. For if I take the time interval from now to infinity, for that time interval, the extrinsic value should be enormous, because presumably everything is getting better and we're slowly building up towards some sort of a great utopia where things are going to be better, and they're going to keep getting better, and they're going to gravitate towards some sort of asymptotically gravitate towards some sort of utopic point. For what that means is that intrinsic value is constantly going to be increasing, or it's going to increase and then plateau, in which case, again, if I take a large enough time interval, the extrinsic value would still be positive. It won't necessarily be enormous, but it should still be a positive value. If intrinsic value ends up plateauing, then extrinsic value will sort of decrease and get close to zero, because of that. That's how rates of change work. But the point is, it's a rate of change. So if I take, from today to 1,000,000 years from now, there's a huge, net average increase in intrinsic value, for all the humans on planet Earth, then minus the intrinsic value that exists today divided by the time interval, that is going to be the rate of change. And that rate of change should be huge, basically. Or it should be positive, and that would be the extrinsic value of that whole experience. So the point is, the idea with extrinsic value is that everything actually has extrinsic value, even absolutely terrible acts. So, for example, if I drop a nuke on Hiroshima, that has terrible intrinsic value, but it might have positive extrinsic value, because what that demonstrates is the destructive nuclear power of nuclear weapons, and so now there's going to be an accord, and we never use nuclear weapons again, and this event ends up being the reason why we don't ever use this again. And we know, evolutionarily, not to repeat this. So with extrinsic value, you can actually look at every terrible act throughout history, and every terrible decision, and every terrible, intrinsically awful experience, and say that it's positive, because what it does, in the very least, is it demonstrates its negativity, and hence it compels us to avoid having such experiences, or allowing such experiences to take place. And so it's still useful. So it's still useful to do a terrible thing. It's kind of like the argument, do you need to know what evil is to know what good is? Do you need to know about something bad to know about something good? I don't think you do, because I think we have history and we have art to teach us about what's bad and to give us that wisdom. But that's part of the point, right? That stuff would not be in our art or our history if somebody didn't make those mistakes in the past and didn't have those terrible experiences in the past. So in a way, all the horrors and atrocities that have happened throughout history are great things, because they have taught us today not to do that stuff. So we know those are things you don't want to do. So in a weird, counterintuitive way, those things are actually positives. They're not intrinsically positive, right? They have no intrinsic value. They have very negative intrinsic value. But they have a large extrinsic value, because presumably we have learned not to repeat those same mistakes and create those experiences for ourselves or other people. Now, this all boils down to arguing from the perspective of a consciousness, but presumably, regardless of which consciousness I take, the intrinsic value of all of society, the state of society, is equally tied to the intrinsic value from the perspective of any person within society, because because the state of the system is shared equally amongst all people within society. No one person is independent of all the other interactions that happen within the system. So the system affects you. So, for example, in the example where I throw the apple at you, that might have a positively intrinsic value to me, but it might have negative extrinsic value for me, because now that I threw the apple at you, you are upset, you don't like me, and you're not going to be friends with me. And there's a problem there. I'm less likely to be successful if you and I are not friends. Well, let's say we're two people on an island, then I'm less likely to be successful on this island if you and I can't get along. So if we're on an island, it would make no sense for me to throw an apple at you. Again, this sounds obvious, but it's a very important philosophical point, because, like I just said, we must distinguish. Well, it's important. I find in arguments, somebody will make the case. It's just yes, Donald Trump would be great, because he's going to do so much terrible things that things are going to improve later on. Well, see, what you're doing there is you're not actually looking at the intrinsic value of Donald Trump's presidency. You're looking at the extrinsic value, the perceived extrinsic value. You think that there's going to be a net increase in extrinsic value, and that things are going to get better for society if in the long run if Donald Trump is president. Even though during his presidency he would be a terrible president, right? That's the idea anyway. So basically, that is a question of extrinsic value. Whereas if we ignore that aspect and just look at Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, then it's a question of intrinsic value. And in terms of intrinsic value, Hillary Clinton would be a lot better, most likely. Probably. Anyway, that's not my point. I'm not interested in the actual specifics. I have no answer to that question. Sorry if I tricked you into watching this video by starting out to talk about that. My whole point was about the difference in intrinsic and extrinsic value. So the point is to distinguish between these two things in a serious discussion, because I think if what we're trying to do is maximize intrinsic value, we need to strip away. We need to really try and identify what things actually have intrinsic value and which things don't. So we need to strip away such possibilities as Donald Trump being president and terrible decisions and terrible experiences that have terrible intrinsic value because of some means justify the ends shit. Like, I understand the concept of ends justify the means if it's a certainty. But the point is, we're not trying to look like as far as constructing a proper utopia that we can all agree on, which I think is a large basis for philosophical debates, is more of an issue of we don't actually agree on what the ends are, more so than we don't agree on what the means are. You see, this Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump thing, that's people disagreeing on the means. But in many discussions, it's people disagreeing on the ends. And if you're disagreeing on the ends, it's what you're disagreeing on is the intrinsic value of particular experiences. And that's what you have to come to agree on to have a productive, constructive debate and discussion. So you need to try and strip extrinsic value out of the question. You need to try and ignore it because you're not looking at what's going to happen next and what the perceived increase in intrinsic value is going to be. You're trying to figure out a way that you can sort of permanently, to an infinite time horizon, reach some highest stable level of intrinsic value and figure out what that is and how to get there. So it's a subtle point, but I think it's an important one for the purposes of certain discussions. And I don't know. I certainly think it's important to point out, anytime somebody makes this type of argument, like this would be great because of what's going to happen next. It's just like, yeah, it'll be great because of what happens next, but what's going to happen during this interval might not be so good. So, you're just looking at the extrinsic value, is my point. Anyway, this is all I'm going to say. And cheers, and yeah, good luck.